Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa Theologiae podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa Theologiae podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 10. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 17 and 18 of the Prima Pars, which is falsity and the life of God, since to understand belongs to living beings. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the second and revised edition, translated by the fathers of the English Dominican province. And so here we go. Article 1. Does falsity exist in things? What is falsity, first of all? Aquinas will say later on, for as truth implies an adequate apprehension of a thing, so falsity implies the contrary. If truth is a quality of the thing with the mind, such as when I think I am recording this podcast, then that thought is true because it matches reality. Then an example of falsity would be like saying or thinking, I am not recording this podcast. This would be a false thought. Our first article asks, does falsity exist in things, not just in the mind? Like, can I be false as a being? And I cannot, insofar as what I am corresponds perfectly to God's knowledge of me. God knows everything, of course, but I can be false insofar as I depart from the moral law. Here, there is a sense in which I, the thing, do not conform to the mind of God, considered as lawgiver. This is why sins and sinners are themselves sometimes called lies. Think of Psalm number 4. O men, how long shall my honor suffer shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? So too, good deeds can also be called true, as Jesus says in the Gospel of John chapter 3. But he who does what is true comes to the light, that it may be clearly seen that his deeds have been wrought in God. Within this article, there's the discussion of artificial things, crafted things made by rational agents, which can also be called false to the extent that they fall short of what the craftsman had in mind in creating them. They can be called a false work. Such are some of the ways in which things can be called false in themselves. Article 2, does falsity exist in the senses? Not in regard to what Aquinas calls their proper object, the sense's proper object. Proper object would be what the sense senses essentially. So the eyes sense color, the ear senses sound. In regard to these objects, the senses are simply receiving the reality around them and so cannot be false. But the senses can be false in regard to non-essential objects. So taking sight, that would be something like shape, or the image of a thing. For example, I might think that this blue object in front of me is a square and happen to be wrong on that, or think this thing in front of me is a human being when it's actually a mannequin, let's say. But when it comes to the mere reception of color, my eyes are not false unless, of course, I am blind or there is some other defect within the sense. Think of how illness can affect the taste of things. However, falsity is essentially an intellectual thing, not a sensual thing, which is our next article. Is falsity in the intellect? Aristotle gives us the answer. Where there is composition of objects understood, there is truth and falsehood, because truth is a quality with the thought and the thing, and the mere reception of essences, and just getting what a thing is. The mind is kind of like the eyes, receiving color. There's no mistake to be made there. But mistakes can be made in the judgments that follow that intel. For example, in apprehending what a human being is, but then going on to mistakenly judge that a child in the womb is not a human being. Or if by a composition of things, I put together notions that are mutually exclusive, such as an angel must exist in some place, must have some dimensions, be extended in space. It is in this process of judgment, saying a thing is or is not incorrectly, which makes falsity possible. The last article of this question, whether true and false are contraries. Now, some said no, in the way that non-being and being are not contraries. Non-being just doesn't exist. It can't be contrary to being because it is nothing. And because truth and being are identical, only differing in idea, the thought was the same would hold true about truth, namely that it doesn't have a contrary. And the essence of this objection is that contraries must have something in common in order to be opposed to one another. They need a common arena. Think about opposing football teams. They agree in that they are football teams, allowing them to be opposed football teams. Angels and demons are opposed to one another, or contraries, because they share a common category of immaterial spirits. Truth and falsity are contraries because they are both within the intellect and specifically in the judgment of the intellect. Both are assertions, and so can be contrary assertions, as Aquinas writes. For as truth implies an adequate apprehension of a thing, so falsity implies the contrary. Hence it is clear that true and false are contraries. On to our next question within this episode, which is on the life of God. First of all, what do we mean by living or life? We mean a kind of thing which is its own principle of movement. Contrast the stone with the plant. A plant will move itself towards the sun, but the stone will have to be moved by something else if it's going to go anywhere. This also makes life a kind of perfection in things, since humans and irrational animals and plants are just ontologically better kinds of things than the inanimate. They're superior according to their being. And if life is a kind of perfection, not bringing with it any essential aspect of imperfection within the notion of it, kind of like intelligence or voluntariness, then we are right to ask how it exists in God, who is the font and the pinnacle of all perfection. So the first article, and we'll get there eventually, our first article, are all natural things alive. Natural here contrasted with the artificial, things like tables, cars, homes. Now there's more nuances to that distinction and definition, but we'll pass over that for now. Our answer is no, according to what we've said already. Here are the words of Aquinas, giving our definition of life within it as well. Accordingly, all things are said to be alive that determine themselves to movement or operation of any kind, whereas those things that cannot by their nature do so cannot be called living, unless they are called that by some similarity to living things. Is life a kind of operation? Is it a kind of action? Even if it was, it would still say something about the essence of things, for action follows being. We are intelligent beings, and therefore can act intelligently through understanding and will. It is true that we judge a thing to be alive by its operations, either by the movement of nature, like the plants, or through accompanying sense or thought, like animals, and then us, the rational animal. But this is only possible because the plant, the animal, and us are kinds of living things. So life is first of all a description of things. Man is a kind of living thing, even when he stops moving or is not consciously deliberating. In the words of St. Thomas, the name living is given from a certain external appearance, namely self-movement, yet not precisely to signify this, but rather a substance to which self-movement and the application of itself to any kind of operation belongs naturally. To live accordingly is nothing else than to exist in this or that nature, one capable, naturally capable of self-movement. Now, can life be attributed to God? The psalmist responds in Psalm 83, "My heart and my flesh have rejoiced in the living God." Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Now, we talked about what it meant to be truth in the last episode. Now we talk about what it means for God to be life. We've seen that to be living is to be a kind of thing that is its own principle of movement, within which there is a hierarchy of that movement, an increasingly self-determined movement, which makes for a hierarchy within the notion of living. Phrased another way, the more alive a thing is, the more self-determining it is of its motion or action, as opposed to being determined by something exterior to it, whether that be circumstance or another being. Think about the stone. We say the stone is not alive because its motion is entirely determined by its nature and environment, coupled with the fact that obviously it does not move itself. A plant moves itself, but its movement is determined by non-rational, non-sensitive nature. It pursues growth via the kind of thing that it is. An animal can move itself, and it can do so not merely as determined by nature and circumstance, but based on its operation of sense knowledge coupled with instinct, which is another kind of knowledge, and therefore its motion is freer, if we may say so, more voluntary, if we may say so, than that of the plant. Then there is us, which moves actually voluntarily, actually freely, through our knowledge of the essence of things coupled with sense perception. Yet even we are determined by our natural end, happiness. It is the end for which we do all other things, not by choice, but by nature. Although we do choose what we think will bring us that happiness, the object that we're pursuing, and we do voluntarily will the means to that end. In addition to that, we are also reliant upon an uncaused cause, which is God, to move us to act without destroying our freedom of course. That was episode 2 on the 5 ways or proofs for God. Then above all else is God, whose end or goal and the means to that goal and the cause of movement to that goal are all identical with himself. He is entirely undetermined by anything outside of him, either as cause or as goal or as means to that goal. He is most free, most self-determining, most principle of his own action, his own intellect being his own will, being his essence. Therefore, he is supremely alive. In summary, Aquinas says, as God is his very own existence and understanding, so he is his own life. And therefore, he so lives that he has not a principle of life. Again, as Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Last article of our last question of this episode, are all things alive in God? Now, this seems to me to be a question really of how to interpret the first chapter of the Gospel of John, where it says, all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life. Aquinas seems to take the phrase, in him was life, connected with what was said before it about all things being made through God. Therefore, in order to explain how these two notions are connected, Aquinas explains that all things that are made are alive in God, even the inanimate, in the sense that God's knowledge, through which everything is made, is identical to his essence, which is life, as we just showed in the previous articles. Therefore, everything made out here is alive as being known beforehand by God, whose knowledge is life. St. Thomas summarizes this point saying, things are said to be in God as in him who knows them, in which sense they are in God through their proper ideas, which in God are not distinct from the divine essence. Hence, the ideas of things, though not existing in themselves, are life in the divine mind as having a divine existence in that mind. That brings us to the close of this question as well as the one before it, which was falsity and the life of God. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.